Well, good evening. It's Adrian joining you this evening from our cellars here in Villanova de Gaia. I, of course, work for Taylor's Port and also for the sister companies of Taylor's with Fonseca and Croft and Crone and various other companies that we have, because we, as a family business, have spent the last 328 years making fine port, particularly specialising in the top end of it, which is vintage port. And of course, it's my privilege today to have a very special guest join us. And the reason I've actually chosen this vintage cellar is because the gentleman who is due to join has, through his own love of port, not only created a website, but has managed, I think, to probably taste significantly more ports than most of us who are in the port trade probably ever will do in our lives. He's tasted widely, he has done so for decades, and of course he has been kind enough to record all of those thoughts and all of those tastings, along with some of his colleagues, in the website For the Love of Port. And so, for those of you who haven't already guessed it, I'm going to be joined tonight by Roy Hersh, and we're going to have the chance to talk through some of the great wines that he's tasted. I've actually chosen for tonight a bottle of the Taylor's 1997. You know, now 23 years on, seems to me a pretty appropriate moment to be pulling the cork and just seeing how the 97 is tasting. And I have to say, it's now reaching some of those more mature flavours that we expect from vintage port once it gets past 20 years. But it's got still all that lusciousness and all that, deep, dense fruit. You can still see from this colour, lovely wine, full of the intensity that you would expect. On the nose now, a bit more developed, so we're getting a little bit of the leather and spice and some of those sort of notes, but also with, quite some herbaceous and perhaps some almost florals or some sort of rosehip notes on the nose. But of course, like any vintage port, it's the delight of what we get to taste in our mouths, which sort of creates this great wine which fills and continues to evolve, and as it passes across the palate, we get all these wonderful sensations. So this is what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is vintage port. And I've chosen the location here in the reserve vintage cellar for our company, and this is right really in the heart of the Taylor's visitors experience. So many of you might have had the opportunity to tour around Taylor's and to see where we operate, where we in fact have been operating for over 300 years. And then you'll pass through a room where there is lots of vintage port. There's also a display talking about, it's entitled The Anatomy of a Royal Banquet, because it talks about the fact that Taylor's has a royal warrant from Her Majesty the Queen, because she too, I understand, I can't confirm, but I understand she too enjoys a glass of vintage port. So we've got all, that's what happens in the room to my right, and indeed, people get a chance to look into this reserve cellar and see what some of the wines that we have for display and for our own tastings when we have special visitors here in Porto. So the idea today, talk a little bit about vintage port, to talk a little bit about the latest harvests, to have an opportunity for me to reach back to 97. Now, of course, 97, I'd already been in the business for over 4 years. 3 years. I joined in 1994. I joined in a great harvest, and I had a chance to be very much present also at the blending and making, not only of the 94 actually, but also of the 1997. So the one thing, of course, about our business, when you start to drink vintage ports as mature wines, which are ones that you personally have been involved in blending and making, it does tend to remind one that one's feeling a little bit old, even if the wine itself is still full of fruit and vigor. One does remember that this is already 23 years old, and of course there's very few wines in the world that reach this sort of age, and particularly with this sort of aromas of youth and exuberance and all the wonderful things that we get out of vintage port. So it's a great privilege to sort of try this again. And of course, we have recently been trying quite a few vintages, because with our process of declaring a new vintage port, as indeed we did with the 2018, we always have a chance to taste back over the last couple of decades and see where our wines are. So this is like to have this with you all today. Now, Roy is of course based up in Seattle, which puts him in a sort of time zone that's quite interesting, still in the United States, but far enough over to be connected to the Asian markets. And of course the Asian markets have in recent years become extremely important for vintage port, as many of the consumers over there who have great cellars, who are appreciators of fine Bordeaux, fine Burgundy, and indeed fine vintage port, great champagnes, great Italian wines, great American wines. I mean, the one thing that we find when we talk to collectors from China, Hong Kong, Singapore, other Asian countries, is that the people who take wine seriously and wish to invest tend to buy the very best that is produced all over the world. Of course, vintage port is one of them. So Roy, being up in Seattle, very well placed between the different time zones to comment about port and to talk a little bit to the various markets. Because the interesting thing is that vintage port is very much a global business these days. Vintage port, we at Taylor's sell vintage port in over 103 countries around the world. So we've got consumers, small quantities, small pockets of consumers all over the world who are looking for perhaps some of the finer things in life and reaching for a glass of vintage port. It of course is it's a wine that is special. It's a wine that has historically been used to end meals, to have loyal toasts. Goes back to my comments earlier about Her Majesty, where people, at the end of the meal, make the loyal toast to the sovereign or to the president of their country. And so, vintage port has nowadays become a very, very global business with people joining. Now, I believe that we're in a funny situation because I'm stuck in a cellar in Portugal, deep in amongst the bottles, with the corkscrew. One of the most vital things I have is this little instrument here. When this many bottles are around you, this is what you want. Of course, it isn't particularly useful when you get this size bottle. So see, struggling to lift it, hopefully not going to drop it. Going off screen there as I put that Imperial of 2003 down, wishing I hadn't lifted that up. It's nothing like having 6 litres of fine vintage port in your arm to make you think you're off for a good weekend. So here we are. Roy apparently can hear us, is tuned in, is sending some questions, but for some extraordinary reason, we are actually not able to join him. Now, we don't know the answer to that one. It is in technology, but it doesn't really matter. And the reason it doesn't really matter, because what we were going to talk about was just great vintage port. And so, although this is a one-sided conversation, I'm getting at least to drink the port. But I do want to pay tribute in case Roy doesn't come on the line. And I'll tell you that if we don't get him on the line tonight, I'll reach out to him next week and we'll have this conversation. But I want to pay great tribute to Roy and to his website, For the Love of Port, because for any of you who enjoy vintage port, you will find it as a source of a wealth of information about all companies who are making great port. So he's covering big established companies like ourselves. He's covering new producers who are just coming into the industry and perhaps taking their first steps in making great port. But he's been able to follow carefully our industry. He brings guests from across the world to visit every harvest. Roy's harvest visits have become somewhat famous in the Douro because he's a man that is insistent on making sure that he opens all the very best doors for his guests, and they get a chance to taste fine port and to meet with some of the top producers, meet with many of the winemakers who are actually hard at work in the harvest producing these great wines, and really gives people an opportunity to have a very enriched experience with their trip to the Douro Valley. And I think that he comes, as I say, a couple of times a year. I think that that's a great help. He would probably want me to remind everyone that it's not only port that he covers, but it's also Madeira, and he makes an annual trip to the island of Madeira. What this means, of course, is that any of you out there who don't want to come and visit on your own and explore, but want to go as part of an organised group and really go with somebody with very, very deep knowledge about our industry and huge amount of tasting experience, then Roy is the person, and For the Love of Port is certainly the site in which you want to go to find out. The great thing about us in the port industry is we never give up. And Roy, you're online. Nice
Adrian, I've been on the entire time, so I apologize for the technical glitch.
So I have spoken way too much. Everyone's really got exhausted to my voice and my ad-libbing. So let's hear from you. How things over there, and tell us what you're hearing and seeing about great wines and particularly great ports and Madeiras.
Sure. In general, we are safe here in Seattle. Things have started to improve pretty dramatically. The governor hasn't made any real moves yet till the end of this month, but we flattened the curve and things are improving. As far as the wine side of things, from what I see with all my friends and all the Zoom meetings that we wind up having here for port and other wines, we have lots and lots of people going very deep into their cellars and pulling some great bottles. In fact, this morning I went in before I was getting ready, and I have a bottle of Taylor Fladgate 1966, an old bottling.
Whoa, fantastic.
And wanted to try something older than I've been drinking, mostly 70 and 77 lately of the Taylors. One last week was the 70.
Makes me want to reach for this one. Not yet open.
We had that last time you were here.
I know.
So I wanted to ask you, because most people know your background to a degree, but how did going from the banking industry back in the 90s, in the early 90s during the boom years, translate for you joining the port world?
Well, I think given the middle of, we're in the middle of coronavirus, I'd probably say that having lived through the crisis post the 1987 crash and then other great economic moments that we had in the early 90s, certainly has provided me with valuable experience that things can change pretty rapidly, but they typically recover. So, I think all of us have a life's journey that is full of extraordinary experiences, and we'll apply those as and when is necessary. But I think banking and wine are not enormously dissimilar in the sense that you've got, quite a lot on the balance sheet in both cases, and a lot to look after, a lot of responsibility.
Also, in terms of the current status of things, and obviously tourism shut down in Porto pretty tight, which has helped you, the Portuguese, and especially up in Porto where there's a lot of cases, but things are getting better very quickly there as well. I know things opened up about a week ago.
Yeah, I mean,
how do you foresee the tourism sector bouncing back in time?
Well, look, a couple of points you're raising, and certainly first is that the reason that the north of Portugal has been more effective perhaps than the south is because we have the highest concentration of the population of Portugal living here in the north, because this is where the factories are, this is where the economic activity of the country really takes place. So inevitably, with that greater density of population, we're going to have a few more cases than they do further south, where populations are more spread. And even in Lisbon, which is much more about administration service jobs, where people tend to already work remotely, it was inevitable that it was going to be a little bit more in the north here. But generally, Portugal's had a very good time of this, if you can have a good time in a crisis, and that is to say that we've had very few people infected. We've had a very, very low death rate. The controls that were put in place were very, very strong. Fun enough, I was reading on the weekend an article in the Express, which is a daily newspaper in the UK, and they were talking about their 10 safest place to visit in a post-COVID world. And, Portugal was one of those top 10, and many of the others were in fact islands. So it just gives you an idea how people have viewed Portugal as being, as having dealt with this very well and being a very good, safe place to return to. Roy, I talked a little bit about your company and how much that you've done for us as an industry, how many wines you've taken. In fact, I don't know if you've got an account of how many vintage ports you've ever tasted in your life, but you've read a lot, you've written a lot of notes, and you possibly do have the answer to that question.
So in terms of vintage port alone, it's between 9,000 and 11,000. I can't put it more exact than that, but probably another 3,000 to 4,000 wood age ports as well.
That's fantastic.
So somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 at this point since 1983, when I first started drinking at 26.
Started drinking at 26, or started appreciating
20?
port?
Yeah, 26 years old is when I started drinking port, not wine.
Okay, so you'd warmed up on the other stuff before you got to the good stuff, eh?
Yes, and it took me, well, I actually started on vintage port. For 20 years, I drank little else but vintage. Certainly my collection is probably 85% vintage ports. I do love tawnies. I love colheitas as well, white ports, but vintage is certainly my drug of choice.
Well, it's certainly a pleasurable thing to enjoy, and the oil of good conversation, as we say. So here we are having a chance to chat. Now, I've been to your house. I want to tell all of our audience, if you don't mind, that you have the most comfortable dining room chairs I've ever sat in anywhere on the planet. And I just perhaps might ask if you could tell us why they are so comfortable.
We intended, instead of buying dining room chairs, to buy living room chairs and put them around our dining room table, because I would say the average guest who comes over here sits for 6 to 8 hours. There's lots of wine, lots of food. I was in the restaurant business for 30 years, started as a chef in New York, and now my writing of port wine and some Madeiras and other Portuguese wines as well, Dura wines, etc. In addition, I do a lot of hosting of tastings, whether it's at home here or I go anywhere in North America. I've gone down to Mexico, been up to Canada many, many times, and all over the U.S. to open bottles, share some expertise, and host tastings for people. Actually,
Well,
you've been at a couple of those.
I have been to many of those, and thank you very much for sharing your insights. But I must say, your dining room chairs are indeed incredibly comfortable, because I have sat there and had time float by as I've enjoyed great vintage ports one after the other after the other. And it's only the fact that it got dark outside that gave us the indication that lunch was over and it was time to start again with dinner. Tell us, are you hoping to put any of your trips together this year? What is your thoughts on that?
So we initially had 5 scheduled, and we have canceled 2 that were early in the year, and we've moved a couple of them back and have the Port Harvest tours as well. So we'll try and have 3 of them later in the year. Right now we have dates for September with a week in between the 3 different venues that we're going to be visiting. Madeira for a week, the Douro for a week, possibly 2, and also we're going to do 3 regions this year: Bairrada, Alentejo, and Dow, that we'll be focusing on. Usually it's 5, but this year we're going to just focus more days on just the 3 of them.
Fantastic. Well, there's, of course, one of the great things about Portugal is there's a huge richness of different wine regions right across quite a small country. So for anybody visiting on one of your tours, or even independently, it's pretty easy to get from the Minho to the Douro to the Down to the Bairrada to Alentejo and have that opportunity to experience everything. But it takes a little bit more of an effort to get across to Madeira, and yet that's somewhere that you have been to very frequently.
Yeah, I've been over there every single year since 2006, and we love bringing groups there. But we also usually incorporate Setúbal as well, so people get to visit Muscatel grapes and get to learn about those. Occasionally we'll go up to Colares and Carcavelos, but this year it's a whole week in Madeira for some very serious Madeira lovers.
Fantastic. Well, of course, Madeira is possibly beyond vintage port. Madeira is some of the oldest wines in the world. It's not unusual to encounter Madeiras from the 18th century. Tell us, Roy, what is the oldest that you've ever had? And what was it like?
The oldest Madeira that drank well was from 1748. I've had a bunch from 1760, a ton from 1795, and 1790 a few, but 1748 was the oldest.
And did it even come with information as to who actually made it, or was it just?
Yeah, I actually have the bottle downstairs. It was originally part of the Blandys family in their personal collection. So
Fantastic.
That's how I came across it. And in terms of port, I think 1802 was the oldest port I've had. And 1815, I've had several in the last couple of years.
Well, inevitably, with people celebrating 200 years on from the foundation of their companies, or indeed their Waterloo vintage, as it was famously known. Fonseca, our company, was founded in 1815. So many people date, and Coburn's, of course, was also in that year. So many companies saw. What was interesting, actually, was that there were so many people who actually came to Portugal as part of that Anglo-Portuguese army that was involved with the Duke of Wellington, and had opportunity to discover Portugal, fall in love with it, and of course then demand port when they went home. So it was fantastic for our industry, that international exposure 200 years ago, and certainly led to the birth of many companies. But I had a few, I don't know if you're watching the track of the people watching, but there has been a few people asking what the chairs are that you actually have. I mean, I've seen a few of those go through.
All right, I'm going to walk into the house for a second and walk over and people can get a view.
Okay, that sounds the answer. I might have to walk around our cellar later and show people the view of what it's like being on the other side of the glass from the visitors. Where is that your chair? No, that's not your chair yet, Roy.
No. So here is the dining room and said chair. So let's see if I can get this in the picture.
There we are. Built for comfort, used for hours. A testimony, no doubt, to many, many great wines from people who've sat in that chair. So congratulations, Roy.
Never thought we'd be talking about my dining room chairs.
Hey, they're comfortable, and it's all about sit. You know, the great thing about vintage port, as you and I perfectly well know, it comes at the end of the meal. You've eaten your meal, you're satiated in terms of food, no longer hungry, but you want to hunger for friendship, for great conversation, for an opportunity to exchange ideas. And that's when vintage port comes in. And that's why I always use this phrase that port is the oil of good conversation, because, you know, you can sit for a very long time. As you and I have sat also at Quinta da Vagelas out on a terrace on a balmy summer night under the stars, and actually talked about all sorts of issues in the wine industry, all sorts of things happening in the port, all sorts of things happening in the American restaurant industry, and had that chance to really converse in a relaxed fashion with a great glass of port in our hands. So I guess it's inevitable that we were going to talk about your fabulous dining room at some stage.
I don't know if you can see the color of this, but it's a beautiful, very like bronze color, and excellent torrefacted color, torrefacted notes, and a lot of caramel in there. But it's been open now for about an hour and a half. It's drinking stunningly. It's medium to full-bodied. And I think it would even fill out more with another half hour to an hour open. Loads of acidity, no tannins to speak of. But you do get the sense from the acidity of the amazing structure of the wine, and loads of fruit left. It's a little advanced in terms of its color compared to other recent examples, and we had one together last year. But in terms of the fruit and structure, it's in perfect shape as far as that goes.
Well, the 66
was amazing how well they. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the 66 has always been a year which people felt was in the shadow of the 63. The 63 was always very exuberant. It's what everybody always talked about. The 66 was always a little bit more reserved. People were never quite able to make their minds up what it was. And yet now, in recent years, we've really seen that 66 come through and really express its individuality. And it's hugely, hugely different to the 63. So your thoughts as you were tasting there undoubtedly suggest the same, that it's a wine of quite a difference.
I'm loving it.
Good. Now I'm going to just take briefly as we finish here. I want to just take. I'm going to pull up my camera, and I'm going to give you a little bit more of a tour of the cellar. This is my 97, but I'm here. This window behind me normally has tourists on the other side of it who get an opportunity to see where the big sizes, the different sizes that port bottles are, and to talk a little bit about that. And then if we go into the rest of the space, we have a number of very fine wines. We have a lot of imperials. This is one from 1992, but as we pan around, this is probably one of the rarer imperials you'll ever find. But it gives us a sense of where we are. So what I want to do, Roy, because I know we've got
Sure.
very little time left together, is I want to first of all thank you enormously for joining us on this call today. And I want to raise my glass to you, to all of the work that For the Love of Port has done, for the passion that you've had for our industry for so many years. Your great tasting notes, whether it's 9 or 11,000, I don't mind. I enjoy reading them all. And I want to raise a big glass and say thank you. Sorry about the technology to get us going, but it is such a pleasure to spend time with you.
I
Roy
was
Hersh
using.
from the For the Love of
Thank
Wine.
you.
Where are we? You're still there. There you are. You're still tasting.
I'm still here.
You're still here. You've
I
still
am
got
gonna.
your glass. So let's finalize.
I still have my glass.
Roy Hersh, For the Love of Port, let's try to do a virtual chin-chin of glasses. So here we go, see if this works. There we are, chin-chin. Thank you so much, Roy.
Great to see you.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye now.